Howdy, y'all. It's Juliet Necro, the princess of all gamers, and happy Pride Month. It feels great to celebrate my first Pride as an openly queer person. As promised, this month's topic is Hollow Knight, and how my relationship to it has changed. Hollow Knight was released in 2017 by the Australian independent studio Team Cherry, and very quickly became one of the most popular indie games of all time. The PC version has a rating of 87 on Metacritic and a user score of 9.1 out of 10. It's safe to say it's a pretty popular game. I did just notice, though, when I sorted my Steam library by Metacritic score, that Blood only has a score of 77. Whoever gave Blood, of all games, a poor rating needs a serious talking to. Anyway, the point is that Hollow Knight is seriously beloved. I would guess a lot of the reason for the stereotype of all indie games being dark fantasy, Souls-inspired Metroidvanias stems from the popularity of this game, even though I can only think of 3 other games that fit that description. Stay tuned to see if I ever cover those games. Sorting my Steam library by Steam review scores makes Hollow Knight's popularity even more apparent. Only 10 games in my whole Steam library have a greater proportion of positive reviews. Top of the pile is Ultra Kill, by the way. Everybody go play Ultra Kill. I'll definitely be covering that game someday. I say all of this to make the point that Hollow Knight has gained a bit of a reputation, and to give context for the story I'm about to tell. I bought Hollow Knight in a Steam sale the day after Christmas in 2020. Bear in mind that this was when I was in the very deepest pit of my gender despair, although I hadn't realized yet at the time that that was what it was. I was at a point where I had fulfilled most of the ambitions that had motivated me since I was in middle or high school by the time I was 24, and yet I was deeply unsatisfied. The feeling got worse every day. Turns out the solution was to transition my damn gender, but that realization was still a little over a year away at the time. So that was the mindset I was carrying with me when I first booted up Hollow Knight in December of 2020. It wasn't exactly the best headspace to approach art with. Thus, I played the game for a grand total of 1 hour and 10 minutes, and concluded that I didn't enjoy the game. I then proceeded to be vocal about that opinion to my friends and discords we shared. Put simply, I was engaging in one of my most irritating behaviors, and one that I'm still trying to extricate myself from. I was being a contrarian. My goal with this video is twofold. First of all, I want to thoroughly refute my very depressed and dysphoric 2020 self's arguments for why Hollow Knight was bad or overrated. I was unfair to the game back then, so I think it deserves its due now. Secondly, I want to more generally examine my impulse to be a contrarian and make a commitment to better myself in the future. Should be a fun one, let's go. So how did my 2020 self come to the conclusion after just 1 hour and 10 minutes that Hollow Knight was a bad game? I can tell you, her reasons were not great or well thought out, because she was more interested in having a hot take than discussing things on their own merits. Her most common and frequent critique was with Hollow Knight's map, so we can discuss that first. Map screens are obviously very common in Metroidvania games, ever since Super Metroid. Almost everyone brings up the addition of an in-game map as a reason to prefer Super Metroid as opposed to the first 2 games in the series, and they are definitely right to do so. Ever since, most Metroidvania games have followed a lot of the map conventions established by Super Metroid, down to the grid-based aesthetic of the map and its placement in the upper right corner of the HUD. Metroidvania maps also have a tendency to fill in as you explore new grid squares, so that you complete them simply by playing. Hollow Knight throws out a lot of the conventions related to Metroidvania mapping. For starters, there is no map on the heads-up display in this game. Instead, the map is accessed by hitting a button on your controller, at which point your character has an animation to pull out a physical map and look down at it. Immediately, we can see the difference. In most Metroidvanias, the map is purely a tool for the player, without much of an in-universe presence, aside from maybe finding a hidden room that fills in your map for you. Hollow Knight sets itself apart from its peers by having the map be something that its player character looks at in addition to the player. It's a more grounded approach than most games in the genre go for. I apologize for using this word, but it's a bit more immersive. In addition, since you have to hold down the button to see the map, and it corresponds to an in-universe action, it means that the knight can't do much in terms of physical activity while looking at the map. This makes sense, of course. You try fighting someone while holding a big unfolded highway map with both hands. Do kids these days even know what a highway map is? Anyway, that's another way that Hollow Knight's map is better integrated into the fiction than it is in most Metroidvanias. I'm not saying it's necessarily better than the traditional Super Metroid style map, but it's at least an interesting take on the format. Hollow Knight's non-traditional approach to mapping is true in other cases as well. Unlike in other Metroidvanias, where map squares fill in as soon as you explore them, you cannot start filling your map in Hollow Knight until you've purchased the area's map from Cornifer, a friendly NPC who shows up in most of the game's areas. Trying to find Cornifer becomes part of the ritual of entering a new area in Hollow Knight, aided by the discarded pages he leaves behind and the sound of his humming while he works. In another contribution to the atmosphere, if you spend too much time in an area without finding Cornifer or buying the map from him, he'll move on to the next area and leave a note behind for you, telling you to go visit his wife and their shop up in Dirtmouth for the area's map. First of all, this is a nice touch, as it makes Cornifer feel more like an active participant in the world rather than purely a map dispenser. But also, it gives you an excuse to visit Cornifer's wife, who is a total babe. Hello, Cornifer's wife, my DMs are open. Anyway, crucially, Cornifer's maps are not complete reflections of the territory. They leave some areas unfilled once the player has bought them, which is a great choice in my opinion. It prods you to explore the areas further. Cornifer's maps leave just enough of the territory unrevealed that it gives you a lay of the land without tipping the game's whole hand. Areas that aren't mapped are filled in once you explore them, but crucially it doesn't happen as soon as you enter those areas. Instead, it happens when you rest at a bench after having explored an unmapped area. This, in my view, represents more of that integration of the map into the text. It gives me the sense that the knight is updating the map themselves when they get a chance to rest, which makes sense. It would be pretty difficult to make edits to the map with a pen while you're getting attacked by hostile bugs all over the place. Thus, it feels like the knight's map in addition to just being the player's. And that's still not the end of this game's map. Welcome to Juliet Necro, where Juliet talks about how cool a map is for over 800 words and counting. I said before that most Metroidvania maps are grid-based and reveal themselves as the players explore each square. But again, Hollow Knight is different. Its map is instead much more like something someone within the game's fiction would draw, reflecting the messy, often organic-seeming caverns much better. It makes looking at the map more immersive, as it allows the player to navigate based on landmarks. Lastly, there's 2020 Juliet's most frequent critique of Hollow Knight's map. Juliet complained constantly, in that very brief window of the game that she played, that bringing up the map did not show the knight's position. We often take it for granted that video game maps will show the player's position, even if it doesn't necessarily make sense in-universe. We could expect Samus Aran to have something equivalent to GPS in her Varia suit, but what about the protagonists of games with a less sci-fi focus? If you're my age or younger, you're used to being able to just know where you are on a map at a glance. We've grown up with smartphones and all. Stick with me, I'm going somewhere with this. For most of human history, though, you had to figure out where you were on a map based on landmarks. So once again, I'm saying that Hollow Knight's map feels more grounded in the setting by not showing the player's position on it. However, the player can purchase a charm from Cornifer's wife that allows them to see their position on the map. I complained bitterly about this when I first played the game in 2020. I thought it was completely unfair of Hollow Knight to expect me to either use my intuition and the landmarks on the map to navigate, or to use up one of my charm notches on the ability to see myself on the map, which would be a basic quality of life feature in most games like this. However, I was wrong about this before. I understand much better now what Team Cherry was going for by not letting you see yourself on the map, and with that in mind, the restriction of seeing your position to a charm makes a lot of sense. The ability to see your location on a map would have been considered a magical ability, so it makes sense that it would require a magical item in this fantasy game. I was giving Hollow Knight way too much of a hard time before, but was 2020 Juliet wrong with everything about Hollow Knight, or just this? Let's move on. Next in 2020 Juliet's firing line was Hollow Knight's combat. She just didn't vibe with the way the game felt during combat in a general sense. Here again, 2020 Juliet was wrong as hell. Bad take past me. Hollow Knight's combat owns, actually. The knight primarily attacks using the nail in this game, and it's a very satisfying weapon. For starters, the sound of swinging it and connecting it is just really nice, but it also has a satisfying impact. Every swing that connects pushes the knight back a little bit, which threw me off a bit when I first played the game in 2020. However, this too is really cool, as it gives the knight more maneuverability than they would otherwise have if you exploit this ability to your advantage. For example, you can do the classic DuckTales or Shovel Knight move of bouncing on an enemy's head, which is a great tactic early on before your nail is very powerful. Be warned though, this means that a lot of bosses, and even some regular enemies later on, come with ways to counter this tactic if you overuse it. It's still a tool in your arsenal, but it becomes a question of if you know when it's safe to bounce on an enemy's head. That's the mark of fun game design, letting you get comfortable with something and then testing if you're willing to use it under more challenging circumstances. Speaking of challenging circumstances, let's talk about the way that Hollow Knight approaches healing. Most Metroidvanias have you grab pickups to heal, or carry around healing items that you can buy and use from a menu. On the other hand, Hollow Knight goes for a Souls-esque approach by having you heal using your soul, which is basically your magic meter. While it's not quite as punishing as the Souls series' famous Estus flasks, since your soul comes back gradually during combat, it's still more limited than it is in a lot of games of the genre. Also like the Souls games, you can only heal by standing stock still and completing an animation. Bosses, in particular, are very aggressive in this game, so finding a time when it's safe to get some healing in is often a very fun part of the game's challenge. I actually think it's often harder to find space to heal against this game's bosses than it is against a lot of Souls series bosses. It takes some real pattern recognition skills. It's great. Finally, beating a difficult boss in this game becomes really satisfying since it requires a lot of mastery over the game's controls and the boss's patterns. Lastly, in regards to combat, 2020 Juliet found it irritating how long it took to take down enemies with the nail in the early game. The relative weakness of the starting nail makes its power once upgraded really satisfying, and makes the upgrade feel more like a momentous occasion. All in all, the combat of Hollow Knight is really satisfying to learn, if a little cumbersome when first starting out. In my case, I hadn't been willing to overcome that initial encumbrance when I first played in 2020. But that leaves the real question. Why was I so inflexible in my opinion of Hollow Knight? I have to confess, my reasons for initially trying the game out in 2020 weren't necessarily pure. I saw how popular Hollow Knight was, and I wanted to have a cool contrarian take. Yes, really. I was so desperate to be cool and have an opinion that went against the grain that I went into my experience looking for things to complain about and get mad at. This was one of my worst traits when I was living under the misconception that I was a man, and it's something that I'm still working on excising from myself. I convinced myself that I loved arguing, and so occasionally I would go out of my way to form controversial opinions, specifically to get into verbal sparring matches with people. Don't worry, I was never that white boy in your college class who always wanted to play, quote, devil's advocate, end quote, at least. I kept it to opinions on entertainment and food and things like that. But I was really annoying with those kinds of takes, to the point of getting into screaming matches with people. Mind you, I wasn't doing this with strangers on the internet. No, I was doing this with my own friends, the people I saw every day. If I hadn't formed an opinion specifically to bait people into arguing with me, I was exaggerating my actual opinions to a hyperbolic degree to reach the same goal. For example, I really do like The Last Jedi, and I believe that it's the best Star Wars movie, and I recognize that that's controversial. However, I used to specifically go out of my way to bring it up in conversations with friends who I knew wouldn't agree with me, not out of a desire to earnestly change their mind, but out of a desire to either yell at each other or type in all caps for a while. I convinced myself that I enjoyed arguing with my friends and making an ass of myself, but it often made me feel worse after it was done, and sometimes resulted in having to apologize to my friends later. If you were friends with me when I was pretending to be a man, I just want to say that I apologize if I ever pointlessly started a dumbass argument with you to fuel my own ego. Hollow Knight was one of the works of fiction that fell victim to my former compulsion to have a hot take. I had seen a middling to negative review of the game, and so I primed myself to not enjoy it. The difference between my 2020 self and that critic, however, was that he had gone into the game with an open mind and wound up not having that nice of a time, while I was intentionally going in intending to have a bad time, so that I could get into arguments about it later. When I lay it out on the table, it really makes me look pretty pathetic, doesn't it? So I feel I should apologize to Hollow Knight and Team Cherry for sacrificing their work on the altar of hot takes. I'd also like to make a promise to you, the viewers. You might occasionally see me trot out an opinion that invites controversy. However, I promise that any controversial or contrarian opinion I present on this channel will be the result of honest effort and an open mind. I consider being pointlessly opinionated one of the worst traits I developed while living as a man, so it's something that I want to cut out of myself. Obviously, I value subjectivity a lot, and I absolutely love discussing interpretations of art, and that's what I want to keep delivering, but not to start fights. I will eventually produce a very long video about why I prefer Zelda 2 to Zelda 1, and you can take that to the bank though. That's all for today. If this video resonated with you, please consider leaving a like or subscribing to the channel. I got some really good stuff in the pipelines for next month, so you want to stick around. Links to my Twitter and my anime podcast will be in the description. Till next time, ciao.